Good evening. My name is David Solomon. I'm the director of the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to our annual fall conference. When we had our first fall conference 9 years ago now, we weren't sure that we could call it an annual fall conference. At that time, we had funding for 3 conferences, which we held over the first 3 years of the center's existence. And the topics for those conferences were the culture of death, the culture of life, and from death to life. You have some idea of what we were thinking about at the founding of this conference. Those conferences were so successful that we were encouraged by many of you to extend the series, and we did so, with larger crowds attending these conferences each year. This conference will be the largest one so far, and I'm convinced, having looked at all the abstracts for it, that it will also have papers of the highest quality of any of our conferences. We have really, for the first time in the history of this conference, turned down a lot of really good papers this year, and it was hard for us to do that. But we're at we're at the maximum of the capacity of this building. Some might say we passed it some time ago. There will be over 120 presentations in the next 2 days by scholars from North America, South America, and Europe. We have, as usual, papers by distinguished scholars from the academic world, by graduate students, undergraduate students, clergy, professionals in medicine, law, and the business world, and 2 high school students from Montrose Academy outside Boston. Have you arrived yet? Are our Montrose girls here yet? Welcome. Good to have you guys back. Montrose didn't show up last year, and we're glad that's part of the great tradition of this conference. While we encourage diverse voices at this conference, our conference agenda, as always, is shaped by our deep commitment, those of us at the Center, to the critical response to modern culture found in the Catholic intellectual tradition, especially as expressed in the encyclicals and other writings of Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI. We continue to believe that there's no surer guide to understanding contemporary culture and to shaping it in appropriate ways. We're very proud of the fact that this conference always attracts the most diverse and interesting crowd, I believe, of any conference at Notre Dame each year. We ask our presenters to couch their ideas in ways that are accessible to an educated and non-specialized audience, non-specialist audience. We encourage all of you in the audience to participate in the discussion in the same spirit. We encourage also tough and respectful questions from the floor. We try to create an atmosphere outside the formal sessions in which we can all share meals together and continue discussions began in the formal sessions. We're especially proud of the number of undergraduate students and non-academics who regularly attend this conference. As usual, Baylor University has provided air transportation for a number of their finest undergraduate students to attend this conference, as they've done from the beginning. The University of St. Thomas and a number of other colleges and universities around the Midwest and on the East Coast have also sent large contingents of students to join us. We welcome all of you and encourage you to participate fully in the feast of conversation that will ensue over the next couple of days. Our topic for this year's conference is The Family Searching for Fairest Love. We take that title from a line in Pope John Paul's 1994 letter to families, in which he says, "The contemporary family, like families in every age, is searching for fairest love." That seemed to us to set a topic we all needed to think about. The general topic of the family has been suggested by many of you in this room over the years, and it seems especially appropriate to us at the Center this year that we focus on this topic, since this year marks the anniversary of 2 landmark papal documents pertaining to the modern family, Humanae Vitae, the 1968 encyclical, and Mulieris Dignitatem, the 1988 apostolic letter on the dignity and status of women. Appropriately, our 2 keynotes, the one tonight and tomorrow night, will focus on the issues raised in these 2 remarkable documents. Professor Finnis speaking this evening on issues arising from Humanae Vitae, and Professor Schultz speaking tomorrow night on issues arising from Mulieris Dignitatem. One brief word on our benefactors for this conference. This is an expensive conference. None of you in this room are paying the full freight, what it costs for us to run this conference. And that doesn't bother. We're happy to have you here. We'd like to keep things cheap. We like a big crowd. But it's expensive. It would be impossible for us to put this conference on with the very modest registration fees. And we know, as all of you know, since almost all of you got your registration fees reduced, all you have to do is ask to have them reduced, and we're a bunch of softies. I shouldn't give this away, but the registration fees don't pay for this conference. We have many friends, and many friends helped in this conference, but this year the brunt of the expenses have been borne by 3 of our supporters, and we'd just like to mention them. 2 of them distinguished alums of this university, George Mays of the Twin Cities and the Mays Foundation, and George Strake of Houston, Texas, and the Strake Foundation. As well, our Sunday Visitor Foundation has provided substantial funding for the conference this year. They will all be paying for the sumptuous feasts of the body and of the mind that we'll be enjoying over the next 2 days. Now, before we bring Professor Finnis to the podium, I just have a couple of details which I'm required to go over. If you haven't registered, registration is right outside here, but by the time this talk is over, we will have a bar. This is a Catholic university. There'll be a bar there where the registration is, and registration will have moved down to the information desk at the north end of this hall. But registration will be open until 10 o'clock, and your packet will contain lots of interesting things. Some people always complain about our program, thinking that we've misprinted it. If you look carefully at the program, you'll see we go through the program twice. The first time is a sort of big, broad outline, and then we start over again with the details. This isn't a printing mistake. This is a strategy. And if you study it long enough, you'll see all the information you need is in the program. We have a business center in this building. This is a modern university. So if you need to use a computer, a copy machine, a fax machine, or some piece of obscure medical technology, you can probably find it in our business center, which is also in the north end of the building. One word about meals. We are really at the limit of this building. The fire marshal has threatened to close us down now for the last couple of years. All of our meals will be in the lower level of this building. Those of you with white name tags are entitled, without giving any reason whatsoever, to walk into the meals. If you have a green name tag, for reasons that might be obscure to you, you can't just walk into the meals. What we ask you to do is to go downstairs, and if you have a green name tag, and wait until all the people with white name tags have found a place to eat. Those of you with white name tags have 10 minutes to get in a seat. Otherwise, it will be given. Now, those of you, we're happy for those of you with green name tags to eat, but you don't have the right to eat for some reason. And perhaps Professor Finnis will touch on this question. This is before the evening is over. So one of our crack undergraduate assistants will be standing downstairs to help you understand this. We would encourage you to patronize the book exhibits that are spread throughout this building, mainly up on the second floor. There are actually some wonderful book exhibits there, and people have come a long way with lots of things to show off, and we encourage you in your free time to browse those books. Many of the exhibits are selling books on site. If you have any, one last question about the hotels. If you have not checked into the hotel, you should do so right away, or they're likely to give your room away. The hotel is completely full too. If you guaranteed your room with a credit card, they should hold it, but I would check anyway. But if you haven't guaranteed it, it's probably already been given away. If you have any other questions about the conference, pretty much anybody around here can answer them. Those of us with a little black ribbon, it makes it look a bit like pallbearers, it seemed to me like, we are officially required to answer your questions. And so those who are officially connected to the conference, you can ask us. The information desk will also be able to answer any of your questions. We encourage you, while you're here, especially if you're new to Notre Dame, to take advantage of this gorgeous campus. I know some of you, especially the Texans, have already started complaining about the weather. You should know that this weather is actually an answer to prayer. We were, on Tuesday, it was forecast, a snowstorm was forecast for tonight, and we thought you were all going to be stuck in Chicago. So this is good weather for November in South Bend. If you've never been here before, you must walk around the lakes. You must visit the Basilica. There's a wonderful art museum about 150 yards from here. If you must see the football stadium, which used to be more of a pilgrimage site than it is now, it's about 100 yards behind us. Two last-minute announcements which aren't in the schedule. With regard to liturgies, we will have a regular Mass in the Basilica at 5:15 tomorrow night, a vigil Mass in the Basilica with special reference to this conference at 5 o'clock on Saturday night in the Basilica, and a Notre Dame organization, the Children of Mary, will be having a special Mass in Alumni Hall Chapel, and everyone can tell you that's a little chapel in this beautiful little Gothic dorm just at the entrance to the campus. Monsignor Charles Brown, who will be speaking at the conference, will be celebrating that Mass at 5 o'clock tomorrow on Friday in the Alumni Hall Chapel, and that's being sponsored by the Notre Dame Children of Mary. There are probably lots of other liturgies on campus which we can talk about. We have had to move a couple of the sessions for various reasons. Let me mention one that's quite a big move. The panel discussion that was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at 3:15, which involves, the topic is Fathers and Sons and Daughters, Aristotle and Austin on Paternal Friendship, with the Calhouns, David and Andrew, with David Calhoun and the Claytons, Andrew and Brian. That will be moved from Saturday afternoon at 3:15 to Friday afternoon at 3:15 in room 114. Now, this notice will be posted outside on the bulletin board, and we encourage you to check that bulletin board regularly, because any other changes in the program will be posted there. I believe those are all the announcements. This lecture this evening is a specially endowed lecture. It's supported by the Jacques Maritain Institute here at Notre Dame, the director of whom is John O'Callaghan, who's here tonight. They sponsored this lecture in the name of the great Neo-Thomist Catholic moral theologian Josef Pieper. So this is a Josef Pieper Memorial Lecture you're attending tonight. I've asked Professor Jerry Bradley of Notre Dame's Law School to introduce our keynote speaker. Professor Bradley himself is a notorious friend of families. His particular family, I might say, is one of the treasures of Notre Dame. In fact, he frequently complains that we all only love him because of his many wonderful and talented children. And I'm sure this must be false. Somebody has regard for him for some other reason. His scholarly, and perhaps the other reason would be that his scholarly research in the law has focused on constitutional issues regarding the family for many years and many other topics. And he's been a tireless advocate both in popular discussions in the popular press, in the halls of Congress and congressional committees for many years for the family. He is a pillar of strength for people who've supported the cause of the traditional family over the last couple of decades in this country. He's a friend of the Center for Ethics and Culture, and he's a friend of our speaker tonight. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bradley, who will introduce our keynote speaker.
Well, thank you, David, but I confess that now I really am a bit confused. Given all the nice things you said about me, I do wonder why I'm wearing a green name tag. But I know that tomorrow I'll have to pack a lunch if I want to make it through the day. And I've heard it said someplace, I can't remember where, that the last shall be first. So it's okay, David. It is nevertheless a great honor to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, John Finnis. He holds chairs in law at both the University of Oxford as well as the University of Notre Dame in its law school. This comes as no surprise to any of you who are familiar with Professor Finnis's lifetime of work as a scholar. For Professor Finnis is surely among the leading natural law philosophers in the world. For my money, he is the leading natural law philosopher in the world. And he's certainly among the leading legal philosophers in the world. His 1980 book, Natural Law and Natural Rights, is a unique and impressive achievement because by one stroke, that is, that one manuscript, Professor Finnis single-handedly really revived what was then in legal philosophical circles, not within the church, but in legal philosophical circles, a moribund tradition of philosophical reflection on the law, the natural law tradition. That has all changed since the publication of Natural Law and Natural Rights. Professor Finnis, in the years since, has defended against all comers, and in my view quite successfully, the main theses of that book, which is now, I think, near preparation for a second edition. Us mere mortals are a bit intimidated by accomplishments of that general sort, but particularly by this accomplishment, since this life-changing, or at least world-affecting book was completed when Professor Finnis was still in his 30s. Professor Finnis' book, 2000 book on Thomas Aquinas, the social and political thought of Aquinas, has become, it's not a classic, or a classic is not the right word, a standard work on that topic. Any other student interested in social and political thought of Thomas has to contend with Professor Finnis' bold, but I think convincing interpretations of Thomas. But what I'm proud about in Professor Finnis' career is really this. In the 14 or so years that John has been among us at the law school, I have noticed an understated, at first slow, but ever-increasing assimilation of Professor Finnis to American ways. Now, we're talking about a man born in Australia, college educated in Australia, went to England as a Rhodes Scholar, and for the last 48 years or so has mainly resided in Oxford, Don and all that. And people, former students, now professors, colleagues of mine even, who know Professor Finnis from those years in Oxford, really described him as really quite a forbidding and imposing figure. But now, when they meet John Finnis in the American environment, they remark about how lighthearted and friendly John has become. To which they attribute all of that to my nefarious influences on Professor Finnis. Professor Finnis has just, for example, decided to go to movies with me. Now, quite unwisely, he allows me to pick the movies that we go to. But the best thing of all, he's beginning to talk like an American. Now, he's resisted the temptation commonly succumbed to by American teachers to entertain students rather than educate them. But Professor Finnis now talks like one of us. Just yesterday at lunch, Professor Finnis remarked to me that in an email exchange he was gently scolded by an older colleague of his, it must be a Brit or some other stiff-necked person, because John in an email to him had said or used the phrase, heads up, and in giving a heads up. Now, I, of course, congratulated Professor Finnis for this way of expression, but his colleague was a bit scandalized. So I nevertheless look forward to, in the near future, to Professor Finnis using frequently and promiscuously, if I may add, such words as swell and okie dokie. And if God should bless the both of us with long lives, I do look forward to the day, hopefully in the not too distant future, when I hear Professor John Finnis say, when I enter the room, "What's up?" Professor Finnis.
Well, what a swell introduction that was. It's a special pleasure for me to be giving the lecture under this title tonight. I once gave a big stand-up lecture like this to a big crowd with Professor Josef Pieper sitting right there in front of me where David Solomon is, he himself having just given a big lecture. And I was lecturing on the virtues, daring to lecture on the virtues in the presence of the author of the great set of little books on the virtues. Well, on retranslating Humanae Vitae. In May this year, to mark the encyclical's 40th anniversary in July, I did a retranslation of Humanae Vitae for the Catholic Truth Society, who are the Holy See's publishers in England and whose pamphlets on Catholic doctrine and culture are a principal resource for the faithful in back of churches and so on, and for inquiring people throughout Britain. Actually, Jerry, it occurs to me that there may be people here, perhaps everyone, who came expecting that the word retranslating had some more dramatic meaning, and I think you should give them or them all a chance to leave right away. The Catholic Truth Society have always had an English translation of Humanae Vitae. As I recount in the notes at the end of my translation, they published one in September 1968, already a revision of the one published in Rome at or about the time of the encyclical's publication at the end of July 1968. And they issued a revised version of this revision in 1970 that remained in print down to this year. The most well-known American translation, which appears on the Vatican website, dates from 1969 and is itself another revision of the CTS's September 1968 version. And all these English translations are essentially translations of the Italian version, published by the Holy See itself in July 1968. And the English version's revisions are intended to line up better with the Latin. My belief is that even if it was first drafted in French, which I don't know, the preparation of the encyclical would largely have been done in Italian, but that towards the end of the process, the Pope would have worked with and signed off the Latin version, which is the only fully authentic text. So when I was asked by the CTS to advise on and perhaps tweak the best English translation, and then found myself dissatisfied with almost everything in detail, I decided to translate strictly from the Latin and to point out in endnotes where and how this diverges from the Italian and the contemporary French, English, Spanish, and so forth. My translation is, I hope, very close to the style, the feel, and the meaning of the Latin. Anyway, what I have to offer tonight is simply some reflections on an encyclical that I first commented on in the leading English law journal in August 1968 because I was lunching with its editor on the day the encyclical came out, and then again in an English theological journal in 1970, and now, 40 years on, have retranslated. The former CTS translation had a, in my view, regrettable blurb or cover note, prudish, evasive, and legalistic. So I wrote a new one, saying, in its profound teachings on marriage, the Second Vatican Council in 1965 stated precisely what difficulties husband and wife can face in relating their mutual love and the parenthood which naturally arises from expressions of that love. The Council reiterated the ancient and once universal Christian teaching that the morality of married intimacy depends on preserving the full meaning of mutual giving and human procreation in a context of true love. It said that some questions about ways of regulating procreation were being studied by a commission set up when the pill became available so that the Pope could give his judgment on how God's law applies to those ways. Humanae Vitae, my blurb went on, is Pope Paul VI's judgment, issued in 1968, applying the Council's teaching to those new questions, and later solemnly reaffirmed by Pope John Paul II and the Synod of Bishops in 1980, it is a momentous restatement of how love must and must not be expressed if it is to be marital love, true to the nature of human persons and of real marriage as a high and most significant calling. Well, I said there that it was momentous because I think any papal document that failed to reaffirm the teaching that had been universal in Christendom until the early 20th century would have been even more momentous for the fate of Christianity, and continued failure to issue any document after the expectation had become widespread in 1967 that change in the teaching was imminent would have been equally momentous for the future of the Catholic Church. That the document was issued and both reaffirmed and clarified the teaching was therefore itself momentous. But the first paragraph of my blurb is more to the point. The very close relationship between the 1968 encyclical and the 1965 council document Gaudium et Spes is left understated in the encyclical and is largely overlooked and forgotten. From its first sentence and through the doctrinal exposition that runs from section 7 to the decisive judgment in section 14, Humanae Vitae very closely echoes the 5 core sections of the part of Gaudium et Spes that deals with marriage. These teachings of the Council, in its ambitious pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world, head towards its statement about birth control in section 51. This statement, like Humanae Vitae after it, begins with a brief statement of the genuine difficulties that lead married couples to consider contraception and/or abortion. Having condemned abortion and infanticide as unspeakably wrongful, section 51 finally comes to the marital intercourse, the acts proper to marriage, whose human and moral character is what is at stake in deciding whether or not to contracept. Without ever articulating the concept of contraception, the Council concludes, so, where it is a matter of harmonizing conjugal love with responsible transmission of life, the moral character of a way of acting does not depend solely on a sincere intention or a weighing of motives, but must be determined by objective criteria drawn from the nature of persons and of their acts, criteria that, in a context of true love, preserve the full sense of mutual self-giving and of human procreation, which cannot be done without wholeheartedly cultivating the virtue of married chastity. In regulating procreation, sons and daughters of the Church faithful to these principles cannot rightly follow ways judged wrongful by the magisterium, the teaching authority of the Church, in its interpreting of divine law. And in a footnote to this, it adds references to the condemnations of contraception by Pius XI in 1930 and Pius XII in 1951, and finishes up, certain questions which need further and closer investigation have been referred by order of the Pope to a commission for the study of population, family and birth, so that when it has completed its task, the Pope may give judgment. Well, what did Paul VI, in approving this footnote, think he would have to give judgment about when the Commission had finished its studies? All the evidence I know of is in line with what is recounted by Germain Brisset, who was closer to these matters from June 1965 through early July 1966, the Commission's report having been delivered to the Pope in the last week of June 1966, than perhaps anyone still living today. Paul VI, recounts Brisset, wanted Gaudium et Spes to say that what Pius XI and Pius XII, like the tradition before them, had judged wrongful, contraception as then understood, is indeed always wrong, but he, Paul VI, was not certain in 1965 whether using the pill is a kind of contracepting in that sense or not. So that was what he expected to have to judge. And what the Council expected him to judge when it said in its footnote that it was not intending to articulate concrete solutions itself, immediate, that is directly, without an intermediary, but only mediately, through the eventual papal judgment. As we know, the Commission's work and his own reflection led Paul VI to see with complete clarity what is nowadays also clear to everyone, that there is no moral difference between using the pill and any other way of contracepting, except insofar as the pill or some kinds of pill can also induce abortion by preventing or even disturbing implantation. His decisive judgment is given in Humanae Vitae 14, without using the word contraception and without mentioning any particular method of contracepting. It identifies the relevant kind of act which of its nature, its identity, the kind of act it is always intrinsically wrong. And this identification is entirely by reference to one's intention as a choosing person or couple. Any act which, when marital intercourse is anticipated, being engaged in, or leading to its natural consequences, any act which is intended, either as an end or as a means, to impede procreation. This defining intention is not any further out intention, such as is referred to when Gaudium et Spes 51 says that the morality of means of birth regulation does not depend on sincere intention or motive. The intention, for example, to avoid overburdening the mother or the family. Rather, the intention specified in Humanae Vitae 14's moral judgment on contraception is one's, so to speak, close-in intention to do something so that a past, present, or future act of intercourse, including any in a series of future acts of intercourse, shall not result, or shall be made less likely to result, in the procreation that that act, might otherwise have had. That is, might have had if one had not done what one in fact did choose, or is about to choose, to do, namely to contracept, use contraception. Since we're talking intention here, all these references to what might result or might have resulted from an act of intercourse are references to what the contracepting person or couple think might result. It's that thought that close in motivates them to take the steps we call contracepting. The fundamental idea is, of course, utterly simple: to have sexual intercourse and prevent that act resulting in procreation. As is well known, because one or more people wanting change violated their promise of secrecy by publishing selected commission papers in the American press in mid-April 1967, Paul VI Commission reported in late June 1966 that a majority of them thought the Church's teaching could change so as to acknowledge that contraception, at least when non-abortifacient, can be rightly used by married couples in some, indeed many, circumstances. But Paul VI was more interested in reasons than in voting numbers. In giving his reasons, he alludes first to the majority's reasons in sections 3 and 6 of Humanae Vitae. In section 3, the proponents of change speak, in the Pope's paraphrase, putting questions that arise against the background of rising population, growing hardship, a revaluation of the personhood of women, and the new opportunities for rational control of nature. Given present conditions of life and the significance that acts of marital intercourse have for spouses' harmony and mutual fidelity, wouldn't it be appropriate to rethink the present moral norms, especially if it is felt that they cannot be adhered to without sacrifices, sometimes requiring heroic effort? Again, applying the so-called principle of totality, couldn't it rightly be accepted that the purpose of making fecundity less prolific but more rational might transform a physically sterilizing act into a morally acceptable and provident birth control? In other words, wouldn't it be right to accept that procreation as a good applies to the totality of married life rather than to each and every marital act? And given that people today are more aware of their responsibilities, hasn't the time come when the role of transmitting life should be entrusted to their intelligence and will rather than to their bodily rhythms? Paul VI's summary of the Commission's majority's thoughts. The key argument here is that respecting marriage's orientation to procreation need not be a matter of preserving that orientation in each and every marital sexual act. Preserving it over the totality of married life can be morally sufficient. The argument is a response, indeed the only response available short of mere rejection, to the Council's teaching that, again, where it is a matter of harmonizing conjugal love with responsible transmission of life, the moral character of a way of acting must be determined by objective criteria drawn from the nature of persons and of their acts, criteria that, in a context of true love, preserve the full sensus, Italian il significato, the full meaning of mutual self-giving and of human procreation. The Commission majority thought the full sense, meaning of procreation need not be preserved in every act, but needed only to be preserved taking the couple's marriage somehow as an enduring whole. Paul VI's judgment about the soundness of that suggestion is given first in section 6. Certain ways of resolving the question emerged within the Commission which were at variance with the moral doctrine on marriage, which the Church's magisterium has taught with firmness and constancy. That reference of his to the moral doctrine on marriage anticipates the last words of section 10 and the first words of section 14. Section 10 on responsible parenthood ends by speaking of a morally decisive design, concilium, manifested in the very nature of marriage and of married acts and set forth in the Church's constant teaching, unquote. From there, section 11 moves to its conclusion about what the precepts of natural law, interpreted by the Church's constant teaching, require of each and every marital act, that it remain oriented in itself to the procreation of human life. And section 14, which as we've seen defines and condemns contraception, begins, on the basis therefore of these primary principles of the human and Christian doctrine of marriage, I must again declare. The full force and meaning of these references to the Christian doctrine of marriage never get articulated in the encyclical. Humanae Vitae seems to take for granted what everyone knows, that Christian doctrine on marriage is Christian doctrine about sex and Christian doctrine about natural law. It's Christian doctrine about sex because its central proposition is that sex acts, by that phrase sex act, I simply mean a sequence of behavior intended, rightly or wrongly, to lead to sexual satisfaction, that such acts are rightful only within marriage. And it is Christian doctrine about natural law because its central proposition is not addressed only to the acts of Christians and doesn't mean rightful or wrongful only for Christians, but is that nobody's sex acts are reasonable and morally acceptable unless they are marital. And this is proposed as part of the content of practical reasonableness, of human moral reasoning, accessible even without the aid of any divine revelation. Both the teaching about all non-marital sex acts and the teaching about this being a matter of natural law have been the Christian teaching from the very beginning, as you can see by reading the first 2 chapters of St. Paul's letter to the Romans, not to mention other epistles of his, or Jesus' teaching about what marriage truly and rightly has been from the beginning in Matthew 19:4-6. That the claim about reasonableness is not arbitrary is made clear enough by close attention to what Plato and Aristotle and the pagan Roman philosopher Musonius Rufus say in the midst of a culture, for the most part, hugely indifferent to male chastity. You can get the gist of Plato's teaching from the conclusion reached, very disapprovingly, in the careful study of Plato's sexual morality by Anthony Price in his 1989 book, Love and Friendship in Plato and Aristotle, where he says Plato's position on sexual morality is like that to which Pope Paul VI adhered against the majority recommendation of his commission that particular acts of contraception should be permitted within a marriage so long as its overall purpose remains non-contraceptive, unquote. And Price is saying that this line of thought is controlling for Plato's judgments about all sex acts, homosexual or heterosexual. You could say, a bit crudely, but as a first approximation, that Christian doctrine about sex outside marriage is for the sake of sex inside marriage. More precisely, it's for the sake of marriage, and thus of all those persons, in the first instance the children, who are benefited by marriage. And I will now suggest some reasons why and how this is so. I'm not saying that the line of thought I'll sketch in the next couple of minutes corresponds to anything that Paul VI or his advisors or the Council Fathers would have mentioned if asked about the reasons for the classic Christian teaching that sex outside marriage is wrong. It's a line of thought suggested to me by some of Aquinas' teachings about marital intercourse, but extends those teachings in a way that I've not come across elsewhere. I've elaborated it in several writings in and since 1998, and will here only sketch it in barest outline. The Christian teachings about sex and marriage certainly don't stand or fall with it. The marital act enables the married couple, husband and wife, to actualize, experience, and express their marriage. But their physical intimacy cannot be really marital, cannot enable them to actualize, experience, and express their marital commitment unless they are resolved that such intimacy will be, and should have been, exceptionally reserved to marital acts before and during marriage. Moreover, their intercourse will be non-marital if, while they're engaging in it with each other, one or both of the spouses would be willing, is conditionally willing, to have sex with some other attractive person then and there. Or one spouse, or both, though resolved to have sex only within marriage, is so indifferent to the identity or personality of the other that the spirit of his or her engagement in their sexual activities is just as if he were doing it with a call girl or she with a toy boy. And those are the two cases often discussed by Aquinas in his exploration of marital fides, about which more in a moment. Such forms of conditional willingness to engage in non-marital sex acts, indeed any and all forms of conditional willingness to do so, make the intercourse of spouses not truly marital, and are thus against marriage, their marriage, and the institution of marriage. But approval of anyone's non-marital sex acts is itself a subtle form of conditional willingness. So married people, and anyone who sees the point of marriage, its indispensable goodness as form of life needed for children and the survival and well-being of society, must not approve anyone's non-marital sex acts. Doing so implicitly denies that choosing to engage in such behavior has the meaning, or as we shall see, the conjoined meanings, that marriage needs the marital act to have for it to enable the spouses, without illusion, to actualize, experience, and express their marriage and its commitment. Thus, the judgment about the need to reserve sex acts to the marital implies also the wrongness of the many more or less manifestly non-marital kinds of sex acts between persons who are not married to each other, or who could not be married to each other because they're of the same sex, or between a person and a subpersonal animal, or solitary sex, and so forth. Hence, the Christian norm, or rather, the norm declared in Christian teaching to be natural, that is, universally reasonable, true and right for all, as Jesus and St. Paul and the whole tradition certainly declare it to be. Of course, this teaching against fornication and much else, this teaching of the chastity required in relation to any and every actual or possible human sex act, has always been regarded as severe and difficult, something that separates Christians or Jews and Christians, from almost all others, certainly from the pagan world, despite the flickering insights of its very best philosophers. It marked out a dramatic equalizing of the status of men and women. As Elizabeth Anscombe, the leading English Catholic philosopher of the 20th century, puts it in her booklet Contraception and Chastity, published by the Catholic Truth Society in 1975 and maintained in print to accompany Humanae Vitae ever since, Christianity, she says, taught that men ought to be as chaste as pagans thought honest women ought to be. And it went along with the other teaching that dramatically separated Christians and Jews from pagans, rejection of infanticide and abortion. The link, of course, is that chastity is needed for sound marriage, and sound marriage is needed for the well-being of children, the fruit of sexual and properly the fruit of marital intercourse. Every pagan knew why a wife's adultery wronged her husband. Christians pointed out, as that rare pagan, the first-century philosopher Musonius Rufus did too, that the husband's adultery wrongs the wife. Their sexual rights in marriage are naturally, that is to say, in right reason, equal. But this teaching of equality in sexual rights only makes sense if the reserving of sexual acts to marriage, and within marriage to truly marital acts, is essential to marriage's point and well-being, just as the wife's not introducing into the marriage the fruits of her adultery obviously is. And that reserving only makes sense if, in Anscombe's words, the good and the point of a sexual act is marriage. What then is marriage's point? Paul VI states it in the first section of his exposition of doctrinal principles, section 8, the first of two sections about marital love. This statement successfully sums up the complex teaching about marriage in Gaudium et Spes 48 through 50, and is stated as an explanation of the phrase we've already heard from section 10, a phrase introduced in section 8, God's design, concilium. Marriage, says section 8, is no mere product of blind evolution, but rather is a matter of a wise and provident design of love. So, I'm quoting, husband and wife, through a mutual self-giving which is properly theirs and exclusive to them, develop a communion of persons by which to perfect one another so as to cooperate with God in procreating and educating new living beings. Unquote. Here, beautifully captured, is the irreducibly dual point and good of marriage: loving union, communion, and responsible procreation. The latter making sense of the exclusiveness and permanence of the former. The commitment to this mutual self-giving which is properly theirs and exclusive to them, this husband and wife, is what the tradition called fides, and Aquinas showed is the proper object of conjugal love and of every marital act, marital intercourse. This fides is not mere fidelity in the modern sense of shunning infidelity. It is also, as Aquinas shows, a completely proper, indeed the most fitting motive for choosing to engage in marital intercourse. And if thoroughly shaping that sex act, makes it a marital act. One of the important reasons why Paul VI Commission became confused was that the huge and pioneering book, Contraception, A History of Its Treatment by the Catholic Theologians and Canonists, Harvard University Press, 1965, by the then Notre Dame law professor, now Judge John T. Noonan, completely misunderstood Aquinas' teaching about why marital intercourse, for the sake of and shaped by fides, is morally right even when there's no possibility or intent to procreate. And what Aquinas calls fides is the core of what Vatican II and Paul VI call marital or conjugal love. And now, with that sentence of section 8, through a mutual self-giving which is properly theirs and exclusive to them, husband and wife develop a communion of persons by which to perfect one another so as to cooperate with God in procreating and educating new living beings. With that, the argument of the encyclical is provided with its key premise, for the conclusion stated fully in section 14 and summarily in section 11. Section 11 concluded, as we've seen, that it is morally necessary that each marital act remain oriented in itself to the procreation of human life. And then section 12 states the encyclical's argument with maximum brevity. This doctrine, that every marital act must remain oriented in itself to procreation, often expounded by the Church's magisterium, is based on the indissoluble connection established by God and not rightly severable by human volition between the two inherent meanings of marital intercourse, unitive and procreative. A key to understanding this is the phrase not rightly severable. Many translations say cannot be severed or cannot be broken. And then people start thinking that there is something about sexual intercourse itself that in any context makes it inherently and inescapably both unitive, body or mind and body joining, and procreative, genital, which is to miss the point entirely. But the Latin is unambiguous. Non licet can only mean that it is not morally permissible or right. In this case, to choose to sever unitive meaning from procreative meaning. And while we're about it, we should notice that this advances the same thesis as Gaudium et Spes 51, replacing the word sensus with the better Latin word of the same meaning, significatio, meaning. Gaudium et Spes 51 said that morality requires the spouses to preserve the full meaning of mutual giving and procreation. Paul VI just adds the precision or clarification necessary to show that the Council's teaching is in line with the whole Christian teaching about reasonable sex acts, that they must each and every one of them be marital. And therefore, since marriage has the dual point and meaning of union, communion, mutual self-giving, and procreation, they are rightful only if in each case the sequence of behavior intending sexual satisfaction retains both these two meanings, neither meaning being severed or repudiated. To make a choice against the procreativeness of any sex act is one way to guarantee that it's not a marital act, and therefore, in the Christian understanding of human reasonableness, is not a morally suitable act for anyone. That's what Humanae Vitae is about. Of course, any act of intercourse by husband and wife can accurately be called a marital act. Any set of premises that could persuade someone of a conclusion can accurately be called an argument. Anyone with whom one has friendly relationships can be called a friend. But if the argument, though persuasive, is logically invalid, it is more accurately described as no argument. That's how a logician would tell the truth about it. And if one's friend, though friendly, betrays you for money, he's more accurately described as no friend. That's the human truth about him. So too, the intercourse of spouses, though between spouses, and perhaps experientially great sex, is more accurately, morally truthfully, described as non-marital if one or both are fantasizing or conditionally willing sex with someone else, or in a different way, if, and this is Humanae Vitae's point in section 12, if the procreativeness that the spouses foresee their act might have is eliminated from it by something they choose to do with intent precisely to prevent or impede that procreativeness. I should add this. There are two related, mutually supportive ways in which the cannot be severed or cannot be broken translation, inspired by the word indissoluble a few words earlier, was not completely wrong. First, the act, intercourse, cannot be marital if either the unitive or the procreative meaning is repudiated. Secondly, if you do what cannot rightly be done and sever, repudiate, orientation or openness to procreation, procreative meaning, from your would-be marital act, that act cannot really have the unitive meaning you doubtless were hoping for either. After all, the unitive meaning is union in marriage, for their love to be conjugal and their act of love to be an act of marital commitment, of the marital fides that, as Aquinas shows, is central to the human and Christian ethic of sex and marriage. It must express, actualize, and enable them to experience their marriage, which is defined by the conjunction of its two aspects, its dual point. Otherwise, the spouses' mutual affectionate feelings may remain, may be vivid, may be expressed in their sex acts, but will no longer be truly conjugal, marital. That's the line of thought that John Paul II made prominent in his apostolic exhortation Familiaris Consortia in 1981, when, after adopting and ratifying the 1980 Synod of Bishops' reaffirmation of Humanae Vitae 9, 11 and 12, he says that, I quote, "The innate language that expresses the total reciprocal self-giving of husband and wife is overlaid through contraception by an objectively contradictory language, namely that of not giving oneself totally to the other. This leads not only to a positive refusal to be open to life, but also to a falsification of the inner truth of conjugal love." That seems right, but it's not the central line of thought in Humanae Vitae, which is closer to the central tradition about the marital precondition for a sex act to be morally sound. Marriage being a fundamental human good, its desirability being picked out in one of practical reason's primary principles, and its point and worth being intrinsically dual, union and procreation, the contours of the former being shaped by the characteristics of the latter. The encyclical twice offers an account of the difference between contraception and the policy of periodic abstinence. Neither the sentence in section 11 nor the paragraph in section 16 makes the matter very clear. I would put it like this. The policy of periodic abstinence involves three kinds of want or desire. First, in abstaining periodically, that is, at those times when they judge that conception would or might well follow from the act or acts of intercourse foregone, abstained from, the spouses have a desire that contracepting couples share with them, the desire not to incur the burdens for themselves or others that would result from having, any time soon, a baby, as they think they might have if they engaged in marital acts at probably fertile times, acts which they therefore forego, abstain from, but contracepting couples do not. Humanae Vitae 16 says this desire is reasonable and morally right when a couple have sound reasons arising from their physical or psychological condition or from external circumstances. Such circumstances could be of many, many kinds. Section 10 speaks of serious reasons derived from physical, economic, psychological, and social conditions, which can make it responsible to decide not to have another child, whether for a definite or an indefinite period of time. Even though, as Section 9 had recalled in the words of the Council, marriage and marital love are by their nature directed towards the procreation and education of children, and children are truly the supreme gift of marriage and contribute in the highest degree to the good of their parents. Secondly, their reason for this policy of abstaining rather than contracepting is that they want each of their sexual choices and acts to be of the kind that is truly marital, because in each act there is retained each of the two aspects of marriage. For they understand more or less clearly that what is at stake in their adherence to the Christian and reasonable natural law thesis that sex acts seeking sexual satisfaction, cannot be rightly chosen unless they are marital in kind, acts of husband with wife, wife with husband, expressive of both aspects of marriage, mutual love, and procreativeness. Thirdly, their abstinence is only periodic, for they desire and from time to time intend and choose to experience, express, and actualize their marriage and their marital love for each other in such marital acts. Each marital act the couple engage in during infertile periods retains its orientation or openness to procreation, because in it they do together exactly what they do when they are fertile and wish or are willing to generate or conceive a child. Unless it is contracepted in any of the ways outlined in section 14, any act of genital union, of uniting by their organs of generation so that the male genitally emits and the female genitally accepts his seed of generation, is biologically a mating and humanly an act of the generative or procreative type, oriented in itself to the procreation of new life. even though in the vast majority of cases no generation can follow, since her seed of generation, the ovum, is not present. As I say in the notes to section 11 in my translation, it doesn't matter whether one uses the words oriented to, open to, or ordered to. In each case, the meaning, I should have said the meaning here in the context of considering contraception, is established by the definition of contraception in section 14. In any instance of genital union, orientation or openness or orderedness to procreation is what is annulled or not preserved when something is done with intent to impede the procreativity of that union because it's thought that the union might otherwise result in procreation. Couples willing to contracept share, as I said, the first of these three wants involved in the policy of periodic abstinence, the desire not to incur the burdens they foresee from having a baby anytime soon. But these couples lack or set aside or override the second, the desire to keep their intimacy fully marital by retaining in it each of the two inherent meanings of marital intercourse, unitive and procreative. Instead, they choose to do precisely what the abstaining couples choose not to do. And insofar as the contracepting couples have the third desire, to experience, actualize, and express their marriage sexually, what they do in choosing to contracept entails that that desire remains really unfulfilled because their act cannot express, actualize, or enable them truly to experience marriage's procreative aspect. Since their contracepting means precisely this, that they are trying to eliminate from their would-be marital act the procreation they fear it would have resulted in had they not taken steps to prevent it from doing so. Of course, couples who abstain periodically will usually be taking steps in line with their policy, steps which make the policy not merely a set of wants, but also an intention. But the steps in question are simply to discover the times when procreation is significantly likely to result from marital acts, so as to know when to abstain. The couple do nothing to impede the procreativeness of any act, nothing to prevent or impede the coming to be of any baby they envisage might come to be if they engaged in a marital act. Instead, they forego such acts, thus fulfilling both, first, their responsibility to serve the marital good and or communal goods in which their marital good is integrated by avoiding the burdens that having a baby anytime soon would create. And secondly, their responsibility shared with married and unmarried persons alike to respect and serve the good of marriage by abstaining from non-marital sex acts. There was, of course, no need for Humanae Vitae to be as elaborate as I've just been, but it might have crisply said that the difference between the choice of periodic abstinence and the choice of contraception and contracepted intercourse is this. In the former kind of choice, the spouses honour their present responsibility not to conceive, and their desire to express their marital love sexually, and the responsibility of everyone at all times not to seek sexual satisfaction in a non-marital way. Whereas in the latter, contraceptive kind of choice, the spouses repudiate that universal responsibility and thereby fail to express sexually a truly marital love. In my last note in the pamphlet, the note to section 16, I summed all this up by saying, in relation to various aspects of the encyclical's terminology that I have not mentioned this evening, these differences of formulation do not affect the moral position developed in the encyclical, for as sections 11, 12 and 13 have explained, presupposing sections 8, 9 and 10, and following Gaudium et Spes 51, the moral point is not that natural processes should never be impeded, nor, as section 15 has made clear, is it that the processes of a human reproductive system should never be deliberately altered or subjected to techniques or artificial methods. The moral point is rather that such an intervention is wrong when choosing to make it is choosing to deprive an act of intercourse, foreseen, present, or past, of its expressiveness of marriages and married love's procreativeness. That is, in choosing to deprive that act of intercourse of its orientation or openness to procreation, its procreative meaning, one of the two meanings that if intercourse is to be truly marital, enabling the spouses to experience and actualize their marriage, must each be preserved and never separated. There is inevitably such a deliberate deprivation of procreative meaning or expressiveness whenever husband or wife do something to impede an act of intercourse from having the generative outcome to which they believe that act would or might otherwise have led by natural processes. Willingness to do this is indeed an approach to birth regulation quite different in moral character from the approach of those who, though similarly having good reason not to procreate, are unwilling to deprive any of their acts of intercourse of procreative meaning or expressiveness, and so instead abstain from intercourse when they think its natural outcome would or might be conception. I should add this: many aspects of the formulation of Humanae Vitae and the elements of obscurity there undoubtedly are in that formulation seem to me to result from a desire which I believe Paul VI must have had, and reasonably so, to avoid tying the Church's teaching to any philosophical or even theological, as distinct from doctrinal, theories or forms of explanation. During the middle and later phases of his commission's work, a highly influential figure was the Jesuit theologian Josef Fuchs, whose course De Castitate on chastity at the great Roman university, the Gregorianum, had for some years been the state-of-the-art treatment of the Catholic understanding of sex and marriage. The book of the course gives a fine account of the two fundamental aspects of the good and institution of marriage, and of those two aspects' significance as the two meanings of the marital act. But the ethical theory or form of explanation of right and wrong, for example, of the wrongness of contraception, that was employed by Fuchs in his course book was little more than this: that natural functions ought not to be frustrated or perverted. Precisely that fragile principle, which had grown up amongst 17th century theologians on the back of a misunderstanding of an argument of Aquinas about lying, was what Germain Grisez comprehensively critiqued and refuted in his book Contraception and the Natural Law in 1964. Grisez's book replaced the perverted faculty theory with a much sounder account of practical reason's first principles and their moral implications, and of contraception's incompatibility with them. But Paul VI was entirely correct in regarding the Christian doctrine on marriage as something that has deeper roots in Revelation, including Revelation's teachings about natural reason, than in any theology or philosophical theory. Grisez's own 1964 argumentation on contraception and natural law has changed and greatly developed in its account of first principles and their moral implications, and his account of the wrongness of contraception has bifurcated into two distinct, though complementary accounts, one pointing to the contra-life meaning of contraception, and the other to its contra-marriage aspect, the latter being closer to Gaudium et Spes and Humanae Vitae than to Grisez's own account in 1964. Anyway, Paul VI steers pretty clear of all theories, likely indicating here and there the possible links between the moral norm about contraception and wider theoretical principles such as first principles of practical reason in his citation in section 10 to Aquinas' Summa Theologiae Prima Secundae 94.2, or the rightful limits to one's powers over one's own body and the reverence due to the whole human organism and its natural functions mentioned in sections 13 and 17. So, in the result, the terminology floats a bit, and articulations of the position are longer on exposition than on illuminating arguments, which are, however, available. The argumentative core, partly left implicit, is what I've tried to identify and lay out a bit in earlier parts of this talk. Paul VI exposition of doctrinal principles contains an additional freestanding element, a review in section 17 of some likely bad consequences of widespread use of contraception. He mentions 4: facilitating marital infidelity and a general decay of morals, offering an easy way round the moral law, I suppose the moral law on fornication and adultery, replacement of respect for women with willingness to use women in the service of self-centered male desire, and willingness to surrender to governments the power to make contraception, sterilization and or abortion more or less compulsory. Now, supposing that consequences such as these were likely and or have actually ensued, in what sense can they be said to be relevant to doctrinal principles? The encyclical is not constructing a consequentialist, proportionalist, or any other utilitarian-style argument that directs you to maximize good consequences and minimize bad consequences and try to work out the quantities or proportions of good and bad so as to net them off against one another and identify the best or least bad and thereby right choice. So what is this talk of consequences doing here in the part on doctrinal principles? Or at least what should it have been doing? I think the point was, or should have been, to help us, in the words of section 21, understand, well, these are words about what spouses need, namely, to profoundly appreciate the true goods of life and family. That is, I understand, I add, their place, the place of these goods of life and family, in the human community of families, neighborhoods, countries, and succeeding generations, and their dependence on virtuous, stable dispositions of character, which are shaped by choices and by the like-it-or-not logic of choices, choices that, like all choices, last, persist in the character of individuals and groups, unless and until, if ever, they are repudiated and repented of. Looking at Paul VI's list, one can see more truth in it than has often been recognized, but it is scarcely the measure, or even an outline or broad hint, of what the last 40 years' developments have made clear about the impact of contraceptions being widely adopted as a morally acceptable kind of choice. The third item about men being used, women being used by men, was incautiously worded and widely mocked, not altogether justly, for overlooking, it was said, women's own desire for sex. And certainly it underplayed the scale of the revolution. Anscombe's Contraception and Chastity opens by asking us to, in her words, contemplate a familiar point, the fantastic change that has come about in people's situation in respect of having children because of the invention of efficient contraceptives. Unquote. She goes on to describe the contrast there has always been between heathen morality and Christian morality, and then adds, but the quarrel is far greater between Christianity and the present-day heathen, post-Christian morality that has sprung up as a result of contraception. In one word, Christianity taught that men ought to be as chaste as pagans thought honest women ought to be. The contraceptive morality teaches that women need be as little chaste as pagans thought men need to be. It was in this post-encyclical essay that Anscombe first reached an insight she had not yet reached, when, in the years before the encyclical, she demonstrated the interconnectedness of the teaching against contraception with the teachings against other kinds of sexual immorality. The new insight was one you've already heard me quote, that the good and the point of a sexual act is marriage. Since marriage as an institutional form of life makes sense only because of its appropriateness as framework for procreation and education of children, the severing of procreative meaning from sex between married as well as unmarried people makes it impossible for clear-headed persons choosing this severance to regard the good and the point of a sexual act as marriage. or to regard sex acts within marriage as expressing, actualizing, and enabling the parties to experience precisely this marriage itself. Instead, as the logic of contraceptive choosing becomes clear-headedly understood and embraced, marriage becomes just one convenient, but sometimes inconvenient, framework within which to pursue what has come to be regarded as the relevant real good, and everyone's right, the good of, and right to, more or less regular sexual satisfaction, the enjoyment of which is rather impeded by children, both in their prospect and their equally inconvenient presence. So the loss of understanding of marriage goes hand in hand with loss of understanding of sex. Change of practical principles entails, as I said, change of character. Of course, the changes of character may be muted, softened, obscured in many ways by people's inconsistency, their lack of clear-headedness, and their partially, perhaps even massively, remaining good character. But since we are intelligent beings, the principles we adopt tend, in our holding of them, to work themselves towards consistency. So more or less radical consequences of big changes of principle start to make themselves apparent, more or less radically, in observable phenomena. Thus we find, observable, very widespread and early fornication, that is, premarital or extramarital sex, running over into bisexual and same-sex sex that may in some cases imitate aspects of marriage by introducing children into the relationship, but that characteristically insists more or less overtly on the relationship's openness, the freedom of the partners, not necessarily a couple, to have sex with others at will, thus defacing still further the image of marriage in the imitation of it. These changes overwhelm whole widespread and historic ecclesial bodies like the Anglican Communion, whose presiding bishop takes his communion's acceptance of contraception to be the rationally necessitating ground for its acceptance of gay sex. Whole societies are subjected to a vast social revolution, as great as any in human history, I think, same-sex marriage, so-called, whose impact on our children and our future can hardly fail to be more profound and far-reaching than anyone can clearly imagine. Again, the severance of sex from procreation smooths the way for generation of children without sex by in vitro fertilization or other reproductive technologies that, like IVF, are more a matter of production of children than of assisting intercourse to its natural destination, and so are involved in other moral evils in the nature of enslavement, radical inequality between producer and product, manifested, but not exhaustively, by willingness to cull, freeze, experiment destructively on, farm for parts, and finally to flush away embryos who are each unquestionably a little male or female human individual. Men become virtually irrelevant to the generation of children. One or a very few anonymous men, invisibly, could supply all the male seed needed for countries full of artificially generated children, only whose mothers need ever be known. Some men respond to this incipient redundancy of the male with a kind of androgenization, one light manifestation of which is metrosexuality as a cultural style. Again, the countries that have adopted contraception most enthusiastically face depopulation on a historically unprecedented kind and scale. And this phenomenon is not, of course, not the result simply of the availability of contraceptives, or even of people's willingness in principle to use them, but of profound changes in people's understanding of the point and good of marriage and family. One of Anscombe's 4 fine essays on contraception that you will find in Faith in a Hard Ground, the new second volume of her posthumously published collected essays, urges priests, back in 1978, when the overpopulation scare was at its height, in the following terms. I believe that the message ought to be, get to having babies. You are going to ruin your country and often your personal future by regarding, say, 2 as quite enough when you have no great excuse. There is already a ghastly dearth of children in the West because of the present fashion. Unquote. But neither priests nor anyone else much thought of, put out, or responded to any such message. And today's European societies, seemingly hollowed out and as if androgenized, and in any case scarce half reproducing themselves, seem to be resigning themselves to surrendering their territories and culture to more fertile people, many of them with a religion of domination and submission and little care for reason's refinements. These are speculative thoughts, of course, which, even if Paul VI had been able to anticipate them, would scarcely have been fitting, perhaps, for the encyclical. Less speculative are the implications and consequences traced out in 1995 in section 13 of John Paul II's encyclical Evangelium Vitae. There the late Pope traces out an inner connection between contraception and abortion. He neither endorses nor denies the thesis that contraception is opposed not only to chastity and the marital good, but also to life, not the life of an actual baby, but the life of the baby specifically envisaged by contraceptors as liable to result from their intercourse, and therefore made by them the object of steps taken precisely to prevent him or her coming to be. The line of thought developed by Grisey and me and others as continuous with a strand in the Church's historic teaching against contraception, a strand which was not taken up in Gaudium et Spes or Humanae Vitae. But having recalled that the Church, in its critics' eyes, I quote, obstinately continues to teach the moral unlawfulness of contraception, unquote, the 1995 encyclical states that, I quote, the negative values inherent in the contraceptive mentality are such that they strengthen the temptation to abortion in the case of failed contraception when an unwanted life is conceived. Because in that mentality, I quote, the life which could result from a sexual encounter becomes an enemy to be avoided at all costs, and abortion becomes the only possible decisive response to failed contraception. So John Paul II observes the pro-abortion culture is especially strong precisely where the Church's teaching on contraception is rejected. 4, to make again my point about principles, where a sound principle of action is set aside in favour of an unsound, the consequences may in practice extend far beyond the application of either principle, since principles are linked in principle with other principles, and the implications of abandoning one may involve several others, as often emerges in practice and its palpable effects. One word about the consequences within the Church. I'm not thinking of the consequences of the issuing of the encyclical, although the effects of clerical and to some extent episcopal resistance to it were very severe indeed. I'm thinking of the effect of accepting contraception. One kind of effect can be indicated by recalling that the Father Josef Fuchs, who in 1966 argued that changing the teaching on contraception would change nothing else in core Catholic moral doctrine, and in particular would leave intact the teaching about homosexual acts, since these acts are against human dignity, the same Father Fuchs had within a few years become central to the proportionalist school of moral theology that left standing none of the core Christian moral teachings on specific kinds of acts and on the decisive moral importance of kinds of close-in intention, and so was judged utterly misguided in the encyclical Veritatis Splendor in 1993. Meanwhile, of course, gay sex took dignity not as a defeater, but as an all-justifying slogan. But among married couples, the effect of accepting contraception was a considerable relief from hardship. If you look on the lawn to the north of the Hesburgh Library Tower, you'll see a bronze plaque saying, I quote, "This area was the site of Vetville married student housing, 1945 to 1962. Many were the trials. Thanks to the Holy Family for the many blessings needed to persevere." We can be sure that some, and perhaps many of the many trials, had to do with the difficulties of periodic abstinence, especially with uncertain ovulatory cycles, and of children coming when not expected. The swathes of young Catholics who chose to contracept with some kind of license from complacent confessors, or on their own license, as the clergy in the late 1950s or early 1960s fell silent about the historic teaching, these Catholics could, in a sense, relax. Those Vetville dates again, 1945 to 1962. Elizabeth Anscombe describes the fading of spirituality, the wateriness of faith, the settling down into worldliness that accompanied the adoption of contraception by many married Catholics and its more or less silent approval by many of their pastors, and gives us a date. It was in 1963, late I am sure, that I became aware of the peculiar, dreadful miasma of the present day that was spreading over the Church. As she said in an address to clergy in my home country in 1978, among the contraceptive Catholic populations there is an awful spiritual deadness which will last until they are weaned from their vices. Those who, like me, can scarcely summon up such frankness can nonetheless acknowledge the justice of her assessment. The trials involved in living a Christian marriage without contraception are very real, and much greater for some than others, in ways whose disparity God alone comprehends and draws out good from in his own providence. But the strength and other spiritual goods which Humanae Vitae describes at some length in section 21 as fruits of the practice of morally right and proper birth regulation are real too, most visibly to the spiritual eye of faith. These fruits build up the kingdom which we have to seek first, and unless despaired of, they will be found to have lasted into the completed kingdom, in which, as Gaudium at Spes 39 teaches in its sublime re-expression of gospel faith, we will find again all the good fruits of our nature and effort, but cleansed of all dirt, lit up and transformed in the eternal and universal kingdom of truth and life, holiness and grace, justice, love, and peace. Still, to conclude, consequences are not what is morally decisive, even when they result from a network of principles that are related to each other intrinsically and not merely by cause and effect, and that work out as virtues, or when unsound, as vices in the character and soul of those who adopt them, and as practices with palpable consequences when acted upon. What's morally decisive is the object of chosen acts, the close-in intention that is defined by the set of means and ends articulated in the proposal which a deliberating person adopts when he or she makes a choice and carries out in acting on it. There is the object of a genuine marital act, to express, experience, and actualize our commitment to each other and our marriage as a communion of life and of vocation entered upon with exclusiveness and permanence for the sake of procreating and educating children. There is the object of an act of contraception, which, whatever the method, will be to prevent or make less likely the procreation which is envisaged as liable to result from an act of intercourse. And there's the object of such an act of intercourse, chosen with the contraceptive impact in mind, and in such reliance upon that impact that procreative meaning is excluded from the act, and with it a defining aspect of marriage, with the entailment that it becomes non-marital, and in its own way like the other kinds of non-marital act which Christians and other reasonable people exclude from their deliberations, in order to respect and keep intelligible the good and institution of marriage. That, I believe, is the teaching of Humanae Vitae, which I've been commending to you tonight. Thank you.
Time for questions. If you would, find your way to one of the microphones, one of the 4 microphones set up at the front of each aisle, here and above. And please, in the interest of time, would you, after stating your name, please ask a question or make an observation, but do so with brevity so other people have a chance to say what they want to say, sir.
Thank you very much for your extremely helpful attempts to explain the difference between the act of contraception and the periodic abstaining. Nevertheless, I must confess I still have difficulties understanding whether or not what you, I think, rightly criticize, namely the contraceptive ethos, does not permeate equally the act of having marital sex during a non-fertile period, while one abstains during the fertile period. It seems to me that the same contraceptive ethos, which is so damaging to marriage, families, and our society, permeates even that. So I do not see the real difference. It seems to me also that it is very dangerous if we shift emphasis. I was really missing in your Roman Catholic account something that we Orthodox take very seriously, namely Paul saying that women get saved through the bearing of children if those children remain in the faith. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part. I couldn't understand.
That part was about the St. Paul's admonition that women are saved by bearing children if those children remain in the faith. Really, the main part of the question was about possible overlap or cross-infection of the contraceptive mentality and those who practice natural family planning. Asking for greater clarity on what your view on that possible connection is.
Well, there certainly is a conceivable way of, well, more than one conceivable way of practicing periodic abstinence, which overlaps with or coincides with a contraceptive mentality. One example is the example that St. Augustine speaks of when he talks about the Manichees who entered into marriage with intent to use periodic abstinence throughout marriage and avoid children altogether, which the Church has always regarded as in essence, nullification of the intent to marry. And certainly whether that's canonically embodied or not is substantially a nullification of marriage, as, for example, Anscombe regularly points out. One can also imagine, easily enough, a couple who are willing to contracept, but survey the methods of contraception and decide that of the methods they see on the list, periodic abstinence is the one that it seems cheapest and most organic, green, and adopt it. That, I think, is in mentality a kind of, although not strictly speaking, certainly in mentality, contraceptive. So those are two instances where I think there can be this overlap. But if a couple have the whole set of three elements that I described in describing their policy, including regarding marriage as a vocation and regarding their periodic abstinence as itself a kind of service of marriage which itself is in the service of children, so that they regard themselves as needing serious reasons to seek to avoid having children anytime soon, then their mentality is clearly distinct, as Paul VI and John Paul II have regularly taught, from that of contraception.
I have a question which may shed some more light on the first question, and it has to do with the sound reasons, or an ultimate expression in Humanae Vitae, the serious reasons of diverse sort, which couples might rightly rely upon to space children, or perhaps delay children indefinitely. And it seems to me that I'm not myself aware of very much follow-up church teaching, even of exhortatory character, much less doctrinal, that talks to the question, I think, upon the minds of conscientious Catholics, probably even some who are willing to contracept, but those who are not, and they wonder, if we stop at 3 kids, is that really being selfish? Or what's a good enough reason so that it's okay to use NFP? And I'm not myself aware of really anything at all of an authoritative nature that answers or begins to answer that question, which I think is, in a way, a central question to what's going on within the church and within culture. People, women especially, are trying to integrate their vocations outside of the home more and more with their vocation inside the home. This question must be much on their mind, and I just don't see anything being said. Is it something I'm missing, or if not, something you might say of a general nature that could shed some light on this?
I mean, as far as I know, you're not missing anything that's out there, but then again, there may be something out there. I don't claim to have read everything, or if I have to remember everything. So I may be doing an injustice to somebody, or some important set of people, or some set of important people. And what I would say, I think I've already sort of indicated partly through the mouth of Elizabeth Anscombe. I think one needs to regard oneself as responsible not just for the well-being of our little family, but of the whole passing on of our culture, our life as a people to a new generation. And unless a lot of people have more than 3 children to make up for those women who are not going to have any or one, our country is going out of business, whichever country it is. It's going out of business. And that's something that should be relevant to all those who love its culture, its history, its memory. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Connor Hill, and just in light of that lady's comment and your responses, it seems as though that the problem with differentiating or with the difficulty of differentiating contraception and periodic abstinence, if there's an overemphasis on mentality and intention, and not so much on what John Paul II calls in Veritatis Splendor the kinds of behavior. If you don't look at the kinds of behavior and overemphasize mentality or intention, then there's going to be the difficulty that she was bringing up. Could you maybe say more about integrating kinds of behavior? I mean, clearly using a condom is a very different kind of behavior, and that acts bear an objective character that needs to be taken into account also, as well as the intention. And this is highlighted, I think, with current debates about using condoms and AIDS, with Ronheimer, for example. Maybe could you say something about about integrating kinds of behavior with mentality and intention.
Yeah. Well, for the purposes of the discussion of contraception and the difference between contraception and periodic abstinence or natural family planning, it is sufficient and accurate to say, as I said, that the kind of act that contraception is, the objective nature of the act, is defined entirely in terms of the intention of the acting parties. The close-in intention, which in Veritatis Splendor is called the object, but then the definition of the object is given in terms precisely of close-in intention. So I think it's important, and I stressed this 4 or 5 times in the course of my remarks. I do want to go on about it, that we think of contraception as defined by its intention, not its further out intentions, motives as lawyers would call them, which may be shared with people practicing periodic abstinence and may be absolutely compelling and good, but it's close-in intention to exclude from this act of marital intercourse its procreative meaning. That's all contraception is. Now, if one moves beyond contraception and considers what you brought up, the use of condoms to prevent infection, which need not be contraceptive, although often, of course, it is, because often the kind of infection that people have in mind is one that it would be very bad to pass on to a baby, and so they legitimately want to exclude having a baby, so they no doubt have a contraceptive intention as well in using the condom. But they needn't, supposing the wife is already pregnant, so there's no question of procreation. If that's the issue, then that kind of close-in intention is no longer precisely the issue. And the issue is rather whether, if we're wearing, one of it is, or both, it could be either wearing a condom, there are female condoms, whether what's being done, what we intend to do in the act, is of the procreative kind, an act of the what I call procreative or generative kind, in which the male transmits and the female willingly accepts his seed into her body, or whether rather it's the male extruding his seed into another container, the condom, for reasons of avoiding infection. So that the act, for that reason, not because it's contraceptive, is not one that enables the parties to actualize, instantiate and express their marriage, because it, for that reason, lacks procreative meaning.
Okay, we'll try to make time for all 3 of the questions, but I'm looking here, please, if you would, be as brief as possible, and get all 3 of you folks to the microphone.
My name is Dan Sportello. I'm a student here, and as a member of what you call the metrosexual generation, I was intrigued by what you said about men becoming superfluous. And my question is, suppose that through the further progress of science, perhaps through genetic engineering, men were to become truly superfluous and indeed extinct, in a word. So arguably you have a whole new, different species on your hands. Is there an objective way to say that this would be worse or even better, or is, because we're dealing with 2 different biologies, there would not be that objective platform?
Well, we're dealing with the world as it is and the kinds of goods that are available for choice for us. And in our situation, the structure of opportunities is what it is. And I think there's not much profit to be had in contemplating a kind of range of opportunities that are simply absent from our world. So I think we should stay with the structure of opportunities for good and ill that we have.
Thank you.
My name is Catherine Rose. Simply a comment. I think personally it's better to use the term fertility awareness than family planning, because in our society, fertility awareness.
Fertility awareness.
Because in our society, which so naturally tends to contraceptive mentality, even as a young Catholic couple, it's easy to fall into the assumption that we ought to abstain for 6 months to get to know each other, rather than being open, to life because we can. We have no grave reason to abstain. So I just want to point out that often also fertility awareness, the different methods can be used to conceive as well as abstain. So I just wanted to simply emphasize that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That the steps taken by couples who are engaging in what is commonly called natural family planning, or I call periodic abstinence, are steps to make themselves aware of their fertility. So fertility awareness is the name of the game in respect of that part of policy. That part. Yes, sir. You get the last question.
Just to return to Mrs. Dilkes-Hayes' question earlier, I just wanted to ask, so I understand that periodic abstinence, the act of abstaining, obviously it can't be something against any sort of marital union, of course, because there's no union there. The question I have is, during those times when it's known that there's a smaller chance or perhaps even no chance of conceiving a new life, how is it, could you perhaps speak to the point of how that act is still faithful to the procreative aspect, even though there's knowledge that in this case it probably isn't going to be procreative at all?
Yeah, the simple, straightforward way of understanding this is to see that when the couple, believing themselves, if you like, knowing themselves to be, it could be during pregnancy, for example, to be infertile, engage in marital intercourse, they do so by choosing to do exactly what they would have chosen to do had they been intending to procreate. That's the substance of what makes their act have a procreative meaning, sensus significatio. It's doing the kind of thing that human beings, and indeed in their own way all animals, do in order to procreate. They do that. They do it fully, without reservation. That's why it's procreative in meaning.
Well, it is time to bring at least the formal part of our proceedings to a close. I am instructed by higher authority, in this case David Solomon, to tell you all that immediately after the conclusion of this talk, these proceedings, the drinks are on him. You stumble or stagger into the hallway and somebody will put a drink in your hand, correctly. So you can look forward to that. But before we do stagger into the hallway, if you would join me in thanking Professor Finnis.